For this video, I want to talk about arguably the single most important molecule in the body. That is a huge statement. It's probably inaccurate, but I think it's got to be considered one of the most significant, and that is ATP. ATP is a molecule that our body uses to do work. Work could be anything from muscle contraction to transporting things against their gradients, among others. So to make ATP, we utilize, or our body utilizes, what we refer to as cellular respiration. And this equation right up here is the equation for cellular respiration. Cellular respiration is glucose plus oxygen gives us carbon dioxide, water, heat, and ATP. Cellular respiration produces ATP via glucose and oxygen reacting to each other, creating carbon dioxide, water, heat, and ATP. Now we're going to talk about cellular respiration in detail. To be very clear, the goal of this reaction of glucose reacting with oxygen is to make ATP. The goal is not to make carbon dioxide or water. Carbon dioxide and water are byproducts of this reaction, as is heat. And as a matter of fact, carbon dioxide can be toxic to our body. The majority of our body is water, so the water produced in cellular respiration is basically negligible, but the carbon dioxide can be problematic in the body, and we need to get rid of it, and generally that is done via the process of exhalation where we breathe off CO2. But the goal of this equation is to create ATP. ATP is utilized in our body to do work. So what does that have to do with what we've been talking about with the selectively permeability of cell membranes and electrochemical gradients? So ATP is used to keep our cell in what's known as roughly homeostasis, but that is not totally an accurate term. It's much better to refer to somewhat of a disequilibrium, and I will highlight that in a moment. But to be clear, as we've talked about, sodium moves into cells. Okay, so in review, we've talked about sodium moving into cells down its electrochemical gradient and potassium leaving cells via its chemical gradient as such, diffusing passively into cells and diffusing passively out of cells. That is to say, sodium moves in passively, potassium moves out passively. Moving into the cell is known as influx, moving out of the cell is known as efflux. Now, if we allowed sodium to continually move into cells, which it's always doing, throughout a minute, throughout an hour, throughout a day, throughout one's life, sodium's constantly moving into cells and potassium's constantly leaving cells. But let's just focus on sodium for a moment. The same applies to potassium. If sodium continues to move into cells, eventually, over time, if we do nothing, that is to say, if our body does nothing, if the cells do nothing, we're going to get a buildup of sodium inside the cell. And if we get a buildup of sodium inside of the cells, we're going to lose that chemical gradient of sodium outside versus inside the cell. That is to say, if sodium keeps moving in, then there's going to be equal amount of sodium on the outside, and as there will be an equal amount of sodium on the outside and inside of this cell. There will be an equal amount of sodium on the outside and inside of this cell. And the same applies to potassium. If we allow potassium to keep leaving and keep leaving and keep leaving without doing anything to rectify this situation, potassium, there's going to be equal amount of potassium inside and outside the cell. So once again, if we lose these gradients, then sodium is not going to come in anymore and potassium is not going to leave anymore. And at this point, I realize I haven't even explained on why we want sodium to come in and why we want potassium to leave. And I'll get there. But we need to maintain these chemical gradients of the cell. We want to maintain this high concentration of sodium outside of cells and a high concentration of potassium inside of cells. And the way that's achieved is utilizing this molecule of ATP. Maintaining these chemical gradients is achieved by the sodium-potassium pump. This is a transporter. It's not necessarily shaped this way. I've just drawn it this way mainly so I could write in the sodium-potassium pump in here. So this protein is the sodium-potassium pump, which is also referred to as the sodium-potassium ATPase. Anytime you see the suffix "ase," that's suggesting we're dealing with an enzyme. So the sodium-potassium pump is an enzyme, and it's an enzyme that's going to break down ATP. And when ATP is broken down into adenosine diphosphate and one inorganic phosphate. And in the process of this breakdown of ATP, or the hydrolysis of ATP, energy is released. In the hydrolysis of ATP into ADP and one inorganic phosphate, energy is released. So back to this protein right here, the sodium-potassium pump. The sodium-potassium pump is going to break down ATP, and that energy is going to be used to push sodium back out of the cell against its electrochemical gradients, and potassium back into the cell against its electrochemical gradient. So what we get is sodium being pumped out of the cell and potassium being pumped back in. So what happens, 3 sodium get pumped out of the cell back into the extracellular fluid in exchange for 2 potassium that get transported back into the cell against its chemical gradient. Now, to be very clear on what we're talking about here, we're now talking about moving entities against their gradients. And this is an active process, meaning it requires energy in the form of ATP. ATP is a form of chemical energy. We will talk about another form of energy known as kinetic energy, but energy is needed to do work in the body, and one of the prominent ways, one of the most ubiquitous and common ways for our cells to use ATP is to pump things against their gradients. The sodium-potassium pump pumps sodium and potassium against their gradients. Sodium out of the cell and potassium into the cell. Once again, if we do not have the sodium-potassium pump working, if our cells do not have the sodium-potassium pump working, we get too much sodium inside of cells and too little sodium inside of cells. So once again, the sodium-potassium pump is one use of ATP to maintain chemical gradients of sodium and potassium.